Welcome back to Religions of Japan. I don't have my usual audio equipment today, so you may hear a little more background noise, particularly from my cat. So apologies for that. But this week we're mostly focusing on Christianity. We're also going to do a brief introduction to Meiji or modern Japan because we switched the date around with the paper due date. So a reminder about our historical periods. We're, kind of covering some of the same time periods we covered last week. Starting with the Sengoku period is when Christianity enters Japan, and throughout the Edo period it's banned. So we'll look into that and delve a little bit into the modern period. So Japan's Christian century is what it's sometimes referred to, the 100 years after Christianity first entered Japan. And it entered Japan in the 1540s because that's when you start to have trade with the West, mostly, not exclusively, but largely Portugal is the influence from which Christianity comes to Japan. And that's because in many of these sort of early discovery and colonization attempts, discovery in quotation marks, of course, religion was a key facet because commerce would finance religion, right? The trade would lead toward, donations to the church, and then Catholic conversion was thought to also enhance trade. So there really was a symbiotic relationship between priests and between the various traders, sailors, etc. So in 1549, the Jesuit order co-founder Francis Xavier came to Japan after spending a good amount of time proselytizing in India, in Macau, and other places in Asia. The Jesuit order is a particular group within Catholicism dedicated to both scholarship and proselytization. So when Francis Xavier came to Japan, he'd already had some experience with sort of translating and making ideas about Christianity known to Asian audiences. What happened in the case of Japan was that God was first introduced as Dainichi, right, the cosmic Buddha. Made a good amount of sense, but then as Xavier and other Jesuits came to realize, sort of what the Buddhas represented, they wanted to make clear that this was not the same as the Buddhas, and so the term Deus was used and is very easy to say in Japanese, and so that term for God was one of the earliest used in Japan. So the height of missionary activity came about 40 years later. You'll notice since this is the 1580s, this is in the midst of the sort of unification process. And by that time, there were approximately 200,000 converts in Japan across social classes. I've heard numbers as large as 300,000, but this to me is a little bit more realistic. And this includes a number of the daimyo, great lords, as well as, again, peasants, merchants, you name it. And there were certain concentrations, for instance, in Kyushu and Kyoto. But starting in the 1590s, there begin to be worries about the power of these Jesuits, not only how quickly they've been converting people, but also in terms of people owing allegiance, to religion over the government and to the Pope as a figure outside Japan that, again, Catholics owe allegiance to, at least by the understanding of the Japanese at the time. So in 1587, Hideyoshi, the second of the great unifiers of Japan, bans Jesuit priests because, again, he's concerned about their influence and role. About 10 years later, again under Hideyoshi, 26 Christians were crucified in Nagasaki, sort of as an example to others to not become Christian. And then finally, once we're officially in the early modern period, in 1614, there's a Tokugawa ban on Catholicism and expulsion of all priests. Again, Catholicism seen as a little bit more extreme and dangerous to Japanese power than Protestantism, although Protestantism wasn't making quite the same inroads. And then in 1620, you have a complete ban on all public Christian activity. No one is allowed to be Christian. Again, you can sort of get away with it in your private life, but no longer can there be any visible Christian symbols out there. And though that, really brings a halt to Christianity, we don't see a final stop until, or, sort of final shutdown until 1637. There's the Shimabara Rebellion, which was not solely about Christianity, but that was a large part of it. It was brutally crushed, and that's where you get the Christian century, right? Starting from the 1540s and ending in about 1640. Okay, so once Christianity is officially banned, you have what are called the kakure kirishitan, the hidden Christians, who still, make it through the entire Edo period, spreading their faith secretly, unless they are caught, in which case they are usually brutally executed. So many Christians apostatize, abandon faith, or go underground, especially those who converted for more sort of political or economic reasons, don't have as much trouble giving it up. Others go underground and continue to preserve the faith as best they can. But of course, this means they're practicing in secret. So you have oral transmission of biblical phrases and stories. Again, no one can really afford to keep the Bible around because if it's discovered, that's a huge deal. So there are various lay leaders in certain communities that do what they can. They can't do everything without priests present, but they try and again keep up, reciting mass and doing some of the sacraments. As you'll see in your reading. You also find a plethora of hidden crosses and disguised statues. Again, you'll see statues of kanon that really are meant to represent Maria, or Mary, who's known as Maria in Japan, because again, a lot of these Christian terms were originally translated from Portuguese. But of course, the government was intent on cracking down on hidden Christians, and therefore you have a few things. You have the temple registration system, which we already know about, right? By registering with the temple, you could show that you were not Christian. And then another way to expose hidden Christians would be these fumie, which you see here on the right, images of Mary or of Jesus or something clearly related to Christianity. That people would be required to step on. And if they showed hesitation or if they wouldn't step on it, they were clearly hidden Christians and thus, were often executed. And of course, somewhat ironically, death was not always but often by crucifixion. And so through this period, you start to have some Japanese martyrs, which sort of add to the different stories of Christianity that you have, that the kakure kirishitan sort of keep up and maintain. So after the period of modernization, things change a bit. Once the country is opened up again during the Meiji period, foreign missionaries flocked to Japan, seeing it as ripe for conversion. Um, and then, Japan has to sort of lift the ban on Christianity after a certain amount of time because, foreign pressure that is coming in a lot of different ways, notably trade, sort of requires them to accede to the wishes of the Western powers calling the shots. And so once Christianity is officially allowed again and churches revived, most kakure kirishitan join the Catholic Church and sort of reacquaint themselves with Catholic teachings. There are a small group, currently dying out, of hanare Christian, or Christians who kept up the original faith of the kakure Christian, because of course over a couple centuries of purely oral transmission, things sort of their teachings changed and shifted a bit. So at this point, we are moving into the Meiji period, and that is the beginning of the modern period. So for those of you who are interested in the modern period, we are no longer in pre-modern Japan officially as of now. And so we'll go over the other periods, but the Meiji period is really known for a period of massive and rapid modernization. So I'm going to briefly talk about the Meiji Restoration and, again, what the Meiji period means in general beyond religion before we talk about some of the religious policies. And again, some of these we'll talk about in more depth next week. So basically, the way the Edo period ends is that the samurai class is greatly weakened, partially because of poverty, when we mentioned the rice stipends and the lack of, accounting for inflation there, and the merchants growing in power. And so when foreign pressure comes to Japan, if you remember the brief history of Japan video you watched at the beginning of the quarter, this is when Cardinal Perry from the U.S. Navy comes knocking. And so when there's foreign pressure via gunboats to open up, they, Tokugawa government isn't really equipped to handle that and crumbles, and therefore their new government forms, actually still largely made up of samurai, but sort of lower ranking samurai from provinces that historically didn't have a lot of power under the Edo period. So the reason it's called the Meiji Restoration is because the emperor is restored as the head of state in 1868. So we have no more shogunates, samurai, no longer in power, the class system is abolished, but again, the emperor doesn't really rule alone. Here you can see, sort of before and after in terms of Emperor Meiji. The top picture is of his coronation, and the bottom picture, he's clearly dressed in Western attire, right? So it's very sort of indicative of what happened during this period. And so early on, there's an oligarchy, a group of, sort of co-leaders that, again, largely come from the samurai class, but were very interested and dedicated to modernizing in order to sort of be able to stand alongside the Western powers. And so after studying various alternate forms of government, by 1890 you have a constitutional monarchy. Again, the emperor is head of state, but with elected and appointed officials in the Diet, which is still what the Japanese parliament is called today, even though it's a little different. So this is a period of rapid modernization and westernization, right? You see changes in industry, in the school system, in economics and how money works, in the military, pretty much every field of Japanese life. You see changes in dress, not only Emperor Meiji, but this is when you start to see woodblock prints of people in ball gowns, and people start eating beef. Again, huge changes across the board. And so really the goal is to become a Western nation state. Again, obviously Japan is in the eastern part of the world as things are currently divided, but they're really trying to match and be able to rival the Western powers that in the 1850s are doing these sort of unequal treaties that they've been able to do worldwide. So in order to, or I guess I should first clarify, again, to think about this is it's motivated partially by fear. This is when the Western nations are colonizing all over the world. Japan has already been able to watch China sort of fall under different spheres of influence and be essentially sort of carved up and really ruined by Western trade and the Opium Wars and all of that. So Japan has a real fear of that happening to Japan, which is why we see this, such change in such a short amount of time. So again, rapid changes across the board: politics, industry, sciences, education, culture, partially engineered by hiring foreign advisors on these various fields, as well as Japanese students being sent all over the world in order to learn these things and bring them back to Japan. Okay, which is what I was. So a noted scholar of religion, Alan Gepard, has actually called the Meiji period a cultural revolution. Some of you who are familiar with Chinese history may be familiar with this term, but you can imagine, again, sort of what it means. We see a wholesale revolution across the board in so many areas in a very short time. To give you just one sort of comparison, the Industrial Revolution, which took a good century or so in the West, takes about 20 years in Japan. So the really rapid modernization, which of course has some fallout later on in terms of the great toll taken particularly by the people involved in early industry and whatnot. So getting to religious policies, there are many. One of the first, as you can imagine, is sort of recentering the emperor, right? As not only the head of state, but sort of the focal point of Japanese tradition, and as you can imagine, largely Shinto. So the emperor performs new and old state rituals, some that have been around since, the Engi Shiki back in the day, when the emperor was truly in power, but there are also some new state rituals invented. So the emperor's photo starts to be hung up in all elementary schools across Japan, as well as messages to the subjects, most notably the imperial rescript on education, which really doesn't say much about how education should be carried out, but just the importance of education and filial piety and harmony between husband and wife and all those sorts of general sort of moral exhortations to his subjects. Shinto is also redefined as sort of the national creed, the official, sort of state patriotism of Japan, and not as religion, which marks a huge shift. So this allows Japan to grant freedom of religion, another thing encouraged by Western powers that already had such freedom of religion, but still keep Shinto as mandatory, right? Because Shinto is no longer seen as a religion, but as part of one's duty as a Japanese subject. There's also something called the Great Promulgation Campaign, whereby Shinto priests and teachers are sent out throughout the country to sort of, kind of remind people of Shinto and what it does, and respect for kami, specifically the kami central to the imperial line, as well as the emperor. So to sort of bring back that reverence for the emperor that they and many others saw lacking. This is partially inspired by the ideas of Moto Norinaga and the Kokugaku scholars, right? Shinto priests are also automatically qualified to teach elementary school. So again, elementary school is where you really start to see the sort of indoctrination of both nationalism as well as Shinto taking hold in the population. You also have sort of a differentiation between Shinto groups that are sort of practicing either local versions of Shinto or sort of their own types of Shinto less connected to the imperial family. These are labeled churches, not shrines, again sort of differentiating state Shinto, as it comes to be called, from all other religious traditions. There are also a number of shrine policies, which again, you don't need to remember all this, you just kind of need to get a sense of how wide-sweeping this was. So you have a standardization of shrine rituals and rites of passage, again, with the exception of Yoshida Shinto and the imperial shrines. Shinto was still very much a local tradition with sort of different ways of doing things. So Now you see standardization across the board, across Japan, of key rituals, as well as rites of passage. This is when you start seeing New Year visits to shrines and sort of baby's first visit to shrines being something that is universally practiced. Those were not really official things before this time. Shrines are also ranked in very clear ways, of course prioritizing imperial connections. So you sort of have the top imperial shrines, you have the top shrines in each prefecture, so on and so forth, in order to show a clear hierarchy. You also have shrine mergers, which seems kind of counterintuitive when Shinto is becoming such a major thing to get rid of shrines. But again, there were all these sort of little shrines around that many in the government saw as, sort of not befitting the grandeur of Shinto, and also in order to concentrate, worship within shrines, either directly controlled or, that were in charge by a Shinto priest, taught in the sort of official ways. So again, concentrating local worship in key shrines and then making everyone go to them. You also find new shrines dedicated to the emperor, of course, to the war dead, and that's not only for World War II, that's actually starting with the Boshin War, which is what led to the creation of the Meiji government. And also later on, as we start to see Japan, what we come to call Imperial Japan, right? The empire sort of trying to acquire its own colonies. Shinto shrines are established there, most notably in Korea and Taiwan and parts of China. Okay, so there's a brief overview, but hopefully helpful. Here's some questions to think about as we get going here. So first of all, what might have attracted Japanese converts to Christianity? Why convert, right? And then later on, why was Christianity banned? What reasons did successive leaders and governments give for this prohibition? You'll certainly see this in your readings. And then how did early Japanese Christians, especially when we get to the period of hidden Christians, how did they adapt Christian teachings to their needs in broader religious context? Where do we see influence from Shinto and Buddhism and sort of how they received or interpreted Christianity? Again, pay attention to this in your reading, your midweek reading. And then finally, sort of thinking about this rapid period of change during the Meiji period, how does it affect particular religious traditions and the understanding of religion in general? This is something, again, we'll explore more next week, but I want you to start thinking about how might, again, sort of the redefinition of Shinto affect, obviously Shinto, but other religious traditions, for instance. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you in discussion.